Well, hello and welcome to the world of economics. Kind of the idea here is to give you an overview of kind of the main ideas, the main sort of the theories, the main kind of the big players in the last couple centuries of Western economics. I should point out that somebody who knows a lot more than I do might point out that the Chinese conception, the Indian conception, you know, dozens and hundreds of African conceptions of economics, etc. Hey, not necessarily being covered here, but we are looking at this as a kind of standard Western-based macroeconomics course, and this will give you some ideas. Some of this is it's going to be a little bit tricky without being in the room. There are some things where with a whiteboard in front of you where you can more easily add and manipulate things, it'll make a little more sense. But if you're able to maybe identify things that aren't quite clear, and we can talk about them in class. If you look at the definition of economics, you will see the official definition, the social science concerned chiefly with the description, analysis, production, distribution, consumption of goods and services. The first thing you might notice is that the word money is not in that definition. Now, below, you are seeing the science of money. That's kind of a way to put it, because in the modern world today, it is kind of money, whether you know, bills or credit or increasingly crypto, etc. That's how things get moved and goods get consumed and distributed and all that. But of course, for the majority of human history, it hasn't been about that. Basically, as Keynes said, it's that whole economic problem. How do we produce enough to survive? That's really what we're at in terms of what it means. It has been called, at least in the past, the dismal science. Dismal means depressing, what a bummer. And you'll see that some of the early economists were not necessarily all that upbeat about humans, human nature, etc. I think it's kind of unfair to call it that, but it is a nickname that you hear periodically. We're going to go a little bit back pre-capitalist, a little bit pre-capitalism, pre-18th century. Really makes sense to go back to feudalism. Now, I know this is like a horrible memory from World History 1, and what is it anyhow? It's not that complicated. What you really have is before you have big, powerful, centralized nation states, you have local lords, nobles. You can call them warlords if you want to. They have their own private armies, called in the West, called knights. Well, if I happen to be a wealthy, powerful noble who controls 10,000 acres, I might decide that, yes, that's my property, but I can't really administer it. I can't really farm it. I can't really oversee it. So I will find a couple of people that I will sort of give the property to control, and they get some of the wealth from it, but of course, at the end, they owe me either payments or a share of the food, or if I'm attacked by another noble, they provide soldiers, military service, etc. And of course, the 5,000 acres that I gave to two separate people, well, they might divide that up into lower nobles below them. The people on top are the lords, the people on the bottom are called vassals, Vassals, and it's really this system in which it's a pyramid scheme. One at the top, a few more a little bit below him, and so forth. And of course, at the bottom, and this is the 99% probably, the serf. The peasant worker had very few particular rights. Really, their right were to stay on the land where their noble had them and hope they can survive. And that's about it. This system breaks down, honestly, in many parts of Europe by about the 13th, certainly 14th into 15th century. Honestly, well, a lot of reasons behind it that we won't go into, but it boils down to there are options. There are the rise. After the fall of Rome, Europe goes through a long period where it doesn't really have cities. I mean, it has cities. It has, 10, 20,000, 40,000 people here or there, but no big cities and mid-sized towns. By about the 13th, 14th, 15th century, they start to rise. Results of the Crusades, results of the bubonic plague, killing off big parts of the population, all kinds of reasons behind it. The bottom line is that a lot of the serfs have other options. If they can escape to the town, they go there. And a lot of the nobles recognize that in the cities where you can buy and sell for gold or silver or printed money when it's accepted, that's a lot more useful than big chunks of land with crops that might prosper, might fail in a given year. So this is sort of the end point of feudalism. Different places, different timeline, of course. Russia, serfdom is legal until the 1860s, but we'll sort of say that by about the 1500s, feudalism is really on the way out. Replaced by an idea called mercantilism. Again, more horrible memories from world history. What in the world is mercantilism? It's not that complicated. I'll oversimplify it a little bit, but here's what we're looking at. In the 15, 16, 1700s, the growing nation states, if you look at a map of Europe in 1200, I guess you would see the Kingdom of England. It's geographically separate, it identified as English. You would not see a France, you would not see a Spain, you would not see a Portugal, a Netherlands. You wouldn't see, they don't exist. This is, again, that period of feudalism where what you've got is a bunch of competing nobles. And by the way, when we talk about a king, all we're talking about is the noble who is the most powerful, who can control the others. Well, there is nobody that can do this in most of Europe in the 1300s, in the 1400s. But by the 1500s, the 16, the 1700s, there is an England, of course. There is a France. There is a Spain. There is a Netherlands. There is a Prussia. Now, Prussia is eventually Germany. It's only the northern half of the German Empire. But you start seeing distinct nation states. And because you have kings powerful enough to try to do this, they think, wait a minute, I want to control society in a way that keeps my kingdom the wealthiest. And a theory developed. Look, there is a limited amount of wealth in the world. Picture a pie. A pie that is 20 centimeters across. That's it. There is that wealth. You can't go out and create more wealth. Wealth is just there. So, my country should control as much of that wealth as possible. Usually, the value is held in gold, so that's why I mentioned gold there in the print. But the idea was, if I am England and France has 15% of the world's wealth, well, that means that England can't have access to 15% of the world's wealth. So we need to find ways to bring more of that wealth into our borders without sending anything of value out. Well, trading, not a good idea. Because if we're trading something of value, that is a percentage of the world's wealth going into other hands. Now, occasionally, realism, you had to trade for some things you couldn't produce, but you tried to avoid it in every possible way. And the king, the monarchy, would also stop private merchants from selling. If you are a grain merchant and you can get, in France, you can get 12 francs per bushel to sell in Spain, but only 10 in France, well, of course, you'd want to go across the border to sell your wheat in Spain. Well, the monarchy, if it could, would stop that and say, no, wheat is very valuable. It feeds people. It must remain inside my kingdom. So tremendous limit on what people were able to do. What are prices? Well, the monarchy decides what's best. Again, it's not absolute. There is private initiative and enterprise, but this is the goal behind it. Well, what do you do? What can these countries do? What can France do, England do, Spain do if they don't have access to lumber, to silver, to gold, to certain crops, if they don't want to trade? Well, because we now have ships that will go across the Atlantic and even across the Indian Ocean to Asia, this is where colonies start up, and it's precisely during this period. The purpose of the American colonies for the English were to serve and bring more wealth into England. The entire purpose of the Spanish colonies was to bring the wealth, largely in the form of gold and silver, back into the Spanish kingdom. That's the purpose behind it. I'm going to ask you to just take a moment, stop the film, and read this. Tell me, who said it and when? And what was he saying? What's the main gist of this? Looking at the main gist, we're seeing this. Why does the butcher, the baker, wake up? Why do they work? Why do they do stuff? Because it benefits them. Look, Every individual that goes out and works and produces something, they're really not doing it because of the public interest. It's good for all around us. They do it for themselves, for their own value. You know what? If we don't restrict trade, if we don't restrict what people do economically, this will encourage people to act, to innovate, to take chances, to try to develop, to benefit the state, no, to benefit themselves. You might be familiar with this work. This man, Adam Smith. Adam Smith was a Scottish philosopher, part of the Scottish Enlightenment, as it were. Remember, the idea is the Enlightenment. What we're looking at is individual liberties, less control from above, abandoning tradition if it didn't make sense. And Adam Smith, although is not the first, is one of the most influential early writers who says, wait a minute, this idea of state-controlled mercantilist economies where the state determine what's done, where we avoid trade, where the people that are running the businesses do it with the state in mind first. I don't think that makes sense. He wrote a book called Wealth of Nations in 1776. And if you remember your U.S. history, you probably say, ooh, 1776, isn't that the same year as the Declaration of Independence? Absolutely. And it's, many Americans will say, wow, the Bible of capitalism and the United States are born the same year. Seems like the big guy upstairs was kind of paying attention here. I think it's a little bit much to say that, of course, but that is a sense that people do point out these both happen in 1776. Smith would have been called by 19th century, 18th, 19th century definitions a liberal. We're going to come back to that term. It kind of means different things today. Meanings of words change over time. But a liberal basically meant an Enlightenment influenced thinker, somebody who believed above all in individual human rights. And Smith would have argued that it is right for individuals to have the freedom to control things in their lives, including money. So there's a philosophical thing. More individual freedom is, all things equal, a good thing. But he also argues that it's even a practical thing. It's not just a moral thing, that it's better for people to have control over their lives. It works better for society as a whole. He argued that the mercantilists were wrong. The mercantilists were incorrect to say that there is a limited amount of wealth and government needs to control it. In fact, he argued that government should stand back and use a laissez-faire approach. Laissez-faire, it's French for to leave to do or to leave alone. That all things equal, government should stand back, let people pursue their own self-interest, not necessarily selfishness. He was a very moral person, very concerned about people treating each other well. But he argued that in the long run, this is probably the most efficient way to run a society. He talked about an invisible hand that basically argued that the marketplace itself, hey, how much should we produce? Well, what should the price be? Rather than having individuals try to determine it, let everything run its course. At some point, if the price is too high, people stop buying. If the price is too low, people stop producing. But if you allow the system to kind of run over time, the essentially perfect price and perfect quantity of any given good is going to be set by the market. He said it's as if an invisible hand came in and placed price and quantity at the perfect level. First of all, he argued that was more economically efficient. The idea that there is a limited amount of the wealth in the world, Smith says that's wrong. And he argues that we can, if we structure society the right way, produce more wealth. All of us can share this wealth, and countries should be trading with each other. He called this absolute advantage. Hey, if France is better at producing apples than England, the English should buy them from France. They shouldn't waste their time trying to produce inefficiently poorer quality apples. This is a rejection of mercantilism. Let me ask you, though, who said this and when. Take a look. I'll stop the video for a second. You can stop it for a moment. It's interesting because when we're in class, invariably somebody reads the first one and says, well, a society can't be functioning if most of the workers are poor and miserable. Oh, this is Karl Marx. This is communism. It's not. It's Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith was not, and people have misread him a lot over the years, he was not arguing that maximum profit must always be the goal. He was not arguing that business people, that the wealthy were better, more honest, terrific people, and they should be benefited by society, they should be in charge. In fact, quite the opposite in many cases. He's concerned about human happiness for all people, prosperity for all people. He believes that allowing relative freedom in the business economic world is going to benefit the most people to the highest degree. But you'll notice that there are some real criticisms of the wealthy and business people here. You'll see in the second one, boy, you get a couple of people together, a couple of business people, and even if they're just hanging out having a beer, they're going to start talking about ways to cheat people and act against the public interest. Sure, regulations of commerce, we ought to got to be careful. We don't want to just randomly throw out regulations, but sure, there are times in which we would need to regulate. And you know what? The idea of merchants and manufacturers, monopolists, the big business people, look, they are not and they should not be the masters of mankind. Remember that Adam Smith is talking about free trade, international trade, in a time where it would take 6 months to get from England to India, where a big factory might have 20 or 30 employees, as opposed to today where you have multinational corporations with hundreds of thousands of employees. I don't know that we can't predict what Adam Smith would say about today's world economy. We can be fairly confident that he would not believe in a complete abandonment of the role of government and society to benefit the economy, to control the economy, or to make the economy work for people. He was not an absolutist from anything that I've read of him. So here's the idea of absolute advantage. Again, this would work a little bit better in class. I'll try to simplify it here. Let's say, and these are, by the way, models, and one of the problems and criticisms of economics, as it's practiced often, is that models are created to illustrate bigger ideas. They are almost always oversimplified, and they don't always relate directly to the real world. Very often, you will see a model like this one that says, let's say there are 2 countries in the world, and they only produce 2 items. Wheat and cloth. Of course, this is not anything close to the reality, but for illustration purposes, you will see the United States is really good at producing wheat. The UK is terrible at it for climate reasons. But the UK has the advantage when it comes to cloth, better machinery, better technology, etc. If there is no trade at all, if the United States and England spend equal amount of time producing both of these, you're going to see that there are some limits to production. However, if the United States were to say, you know what, we're really good at making wheat. We're not as good at making cloth. We are going to put all of our energy into producing wheat. We're going to move the employers there. We're going to buy that equipment. We are not going to spend time with cloth. And the British, a more obvious choice, say, hey, look, we are simply not good wheat producers, but man, do we produce cloth well. You know what? We're going to stop growing wheat. It's not worth our energy, but your people will starve. No, because we will trade with the United States. Now, look at what's happened here. If the United States focuses on its absolute advantage, what it's really good at producing, and the British do the same, altogether you will see 12 units of wheat versus, in the old days, 7, 10 units of cloth versus 9. What have we done? We have produced more wealth, and the United States will trade some of its wheat for some of the British cloth, both countries do better. More is produced, more wealth, more prosperity. Mercantilism was wrong. Free trade capitalism produces more wealth. Here's where we get to the dismal side of things. Thomas Malthus, incredibly influential. Up until about the 1950s, most people talked about or seemed to believe in a Malthusian nightmare of population. This is one I really wish we were in class because it would make a lot more sense. But the bottom line is this. Malthus says, look, we can get more land. We can produce more food. We understand. Here he is, by the way, 1798. This is the very birth of the Industrial Revolution. So he sees the changes just starting to happen in English society. And he said, here's the problem. We know that there's more land out there. There is open land in England. There is potential around the world, but it's kind of limited because at some point, if you have an acre of land, you can produce 5 bushels of corn in that 1 acre. You can't suddenly start producing 15, 20, 30, or 50. That's not going to be possible to do. What you are going to be able to do is get more land, but there will be a steady increase in the amount of food. If you say you have 100 million people worth of food on this planet, you know what? That might increase by 5 million units of food every single generation. Great, you will see an increase. But think about what he says will happen with population. Remember, if there's an ample food supply, which there seems to be at the time he's writing, well, people will naturally have, he says, more children. Here's the story. You've got 10 million people's worth of food. And you know what? It's going to increase by, let's say, a million people a year, a generation. So after 20 years, you go to 11 million people's worth of food. 20 years later, 12 million, 13, 14, 15. The food supply will grow. But he said, here's the problem. If you initially, in 1800, have 1 million people sharing 10 million people worth of food, that's great. But because the average family has 5, 6, 7, 8 children, what this means is that the 1 million population now might turn into 4 million in 25 years. If they all have 4 children, that would mean 16 million grandchildren. That would mean 64 million great-grandchildren. With each generation, you are multiplying by 4. Food goes from 10 million people's worth of food to 11 to 12 to 13 to 14 at 30-year intervals. The population will go from 500,000 to 2 million to 8 million to 16 million to 60 million in that same period of a century or two. Bottom line, he says, as we grow and prosper and develop, the population will outstrip the food supply. And eventually, we will hit points in which people are either massively starving or warring over the few resources. And you know what? There's not much we can do about it. There's not much we can do about it. This is going to be bad. Well, this was pretty much accepted because we saw this. The population of England, of the United States, of the industrial countries in the century after Malthus just keeps growing and growing and growing. And people are having 4, 5, 6 children. And with improved medicine, they are surviving and there's a food supply for them. But eventually, 5 children, 25 grandchildren, 125 great-grandchildren, 625 great-great-great-great-grandchildren simply aren't going to have enough food. Malthus was wrong. What I'd like you to do is take a moment and look at this demographic transition model. See if you can figure out what it's trying to demonstrate. Let me tell you first that one of the reasons that Malthus was probably wrong. He wasn't completely off, but why ultimately his conclusions were not accurate. When he said that, look, on a certain amount of land, you can only produce a certain amount of food. You can't triple or quintuple or tenfold increase the output. He was wrong about that. When we're talking about fertilizers, modern machinery, scientific knowledge about rotation of crops, all of these things. Yeah, it's called the Green Revolution in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and very limited amounts of land produce far, far more food. He was wrong about that. Where he was even more wrong, though, was his idea that as societies get wealthier, they have more children. It appears that this is not the case. If you take a look at this, you're seeing four stages, and actually a fifth stage that I think we have entered. Mostly this has been expanded in the last couple of decades. The first stage is 99.99999% of human history. And by the way, you find a few remote hunter-gatherer groups in the world today that, you know what, it still is kind of like this. Well, here's the story. You will notice that the birth rate is high. Once people are in settled communities, yeah, they start having 5, 6, 7, 8 children, particularly before the birth of the modern state. Hey, you get into your 40s, 50s, 60s, can't work anymore. Who feeds you? Who takes care of you? Well, it's got to be your children. And if you have 8 children, but only 1 or 2 survive to adulthood, you better keep having more kids because you'll notice that the death rate matches the birth rate. In other words, people die young. You do have 10 children, maybe 2 or 3 survive and have children of their own. What this means is that for 99.999% of human history, the world's population barely moves. It barely moves. It might be that every 10,000 years you could see on average a 10% increase. In other words, population is completely steady until, and this is when Malthus is writing, he is writing in what turns out to be the beginning of stage 2. Birth rate, it remains up because what do human beings do? Human beings marry somebody of the opposite sex and they have 8, 10 children. That's what happens. The birth rate remains steady. But notice what is just starting to happen in Malthus's time. And about 70, 80 years later, with germ theory and the first vaccinations and things like this, the death rate drops. People don't live until they're 35 years old. They live until they're 60, 70, 80. Hey, these 7 children you're having, all 7 or 6 of the 7 survive and have children of their own. What do you see happening during stage 2? The population is absolutely exploding. And if you continue that trajectory into the future, as Malthus expected to happen, you will see population outstrip any possible ability to feed that many people. It will be a war of all against all. But something we started noticing in the 20th century, and particularly after World War II, it turns out that as countries became wealthier, more modernized, people understood that their children would almost certainly survive. Once you have modern states that start providing things like, basic social security, old age pensions, etc., and as more and more people are moving into big cities, you start seeing that people on their own, not because of government policy, start having 4 children on average, 3, 2, sometimes just 2. You know what? You see that we see Japan today is probably, well, it is in this declining phase. In Japan, the average Japanese woman today is expected to have 1.31 children. Now, does that mean 1 full kid and then a misshapen? No, it doesn't mean that. It means that for every 10 Japanese women, they would expected to give birth to about 13 children. Now, of course, the men, and there are as many men as women, aren't having any babies. I think you know that. Every 20 Japanese adults will be producing probably about 13 children, which means that Japan's population, 70 million during World War II, 120 million today, it's estimated that in about 50 years, the Japanese population will drop again close to 70 million. Not because people are dying off. They're living, it's the longest life expectancy in the world. Japanese people do not have children. And you find this in Germany. You find this in the UK. You find this in South Korea. If you are a South Korean citizen, you get a bonus for having a third or fourth child. Why? Because the South Korean population is falling. And why is this? Well, again, you don't have to have children because there will be people to take care of you when you get older. That's part of it. But then, even beyond that, if you think about this for a moment, throughout most of history, people were living in rural areas. They were farming. It was agriculture. You produced your own food. You had no real expenses aside from, I guess, buying seed, but of course that turned into food. And everybody on the farm in the rural area could in some way contribute. Even the 4-year-old kid can go out and pull some weeds or bring some eggs in, stuff like this. I want you to ask yourself right now, how much do you contribute yourself to your family's economic well-being right now? Now, there might be an exception or two. I don't think so. All of you cost an incredible amount of money. Your tuition is $8,000 a year. The electricity used, the size of the house. Ask yourself, if your parents had 8 more children, would their life be economically better? And of course, the answer is absolutely not. They couldn't afford it. They couldn't pay tuition for 9 kids. They couldn't afford a house of the size to have 9 kids. Well, this is what seems to happen over time, is that when a country hits a certain level of wealth and prosperity, it will naturally bring the birth rate down. This is why it's projected that although population in the world is rising, it may level off at some period, not for the reasons that Malthus said, because hunger and war will kill us all off, but simply because human beings will probably start having fewer children. The real key right now, you'll notice that the so-called Western developed countries, hey, they're all in stage 4, stage 5, and there's hardly an exception here. Where you see these early expanding, late expanding, and most of the world's population is the poorer parts of the world. It's sub-Saharan Africa. It's parts of Asia that are still less developed. For example, Pakistan, Bangladesh. Now, an interesting question here. How long will it take, let's say, the Democratic Republic of Congo to move from stage 2 to stage 4? Now, population of the Congo today is about 80 million. If the population rate of the Congo were to grow at 4% per year, that would mean that in less than 20 years, the population of the Congo would be 160 million. By the time you all are 60, the population of the Congo would be 1/3 of a billion people. By the time you turn 80, it would be 2/3 of a billion. If you guys live to 100, there would be something like 1.4 billion people in the one country of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Needless to say, that's not something that's sustainable if you bring that around the world. However, if the Democratic Republic of Congo can move quickly through stage 3 with better medical care, with better food supplies, better technology, etc., can it move into stage 4 and bring that population growth rate down in a hurry? If it takes 100 years to do this, we probably can't sustain the population that we'd have in this world. If it can be done in a few decades, very possibly we can. So you start thinking about the role of more developed countries. Can we assist these countries in our own interest even to develop, modernize, technologize, that's not a word, to get better medical care in order to encourage them naturally to bring population growth down? Interesting area, interesting topic. Yeah, you know what? We'll come back to this. But one thing that we are seeing increasingly in the world today is a move to concentration of wealth in fewer and fewer hands. And yeah, we'll come back to this. I want to point out, by the way, the data here is from Forbes magazine, which is not a left-wing communist rag. It is it's a business magazine. Relatively few people are controlling bigger parts of the wealth of the world. We'll come back. Another negative guy, another one of these dismal folks initially, was David Ricardo. He's known as the negativity came, as he said, you know what's going to happen? He called it the iron law of wages. What's going to happen wages will go up, so more people want to work, and if there's too many people working that want the job, the wages will go lower. Bottom line, most people will always be hungry and desperate. Not very happy. However, he had a more optimistic view as well, and this is one that's pretty well established. It's called comparative advantage. Now remember, Adam Smith said, if England's good at apples, France is good at wine, they should both focus on what they're better at. But what if one country is better at producing everything? Let's say England is better at both apples and wine than France. He says, you know what? I've done the math. Trade should continue. What England should do is focus all of its energies on the things that it's comparatively better at. And even if England makes better wine than France, let the French focus on the things that they're comparatively not as bad. Because he brought up the idea of opportunity cost. If you are doing one thing, you lose the opportunity to do another. If you decide to go to the movies the night before your AP test, you are gaining the fun of going out with friends, but you are sacrificing the opportunity to do as well as you could. That's true in life, it's true in economics. This would get a little complicated, and again, I'm just going to kind of run through it. It would work better in class. Again, another model. There are two countries in the world, and they only produce two goods. One is called Zygeria. They produce some wheat, some fish. Another, far more advanced and far more sophisticated and far more prosperous, Skeletonia, produces way more wheat and significantly more fish. Now, the old idea, well, mercantilism, you don't trade. Skeletonia doesn't want to give any of its valuable wheat or fish to anyone. Adam Smith would say, oh, well, it wouldn't work. There is no absolute advantage because Skeletonia is better at both. David Ricardo does the math. You see, the absolute advantage, it's Skeletonia. But if there's no trade at all, do the math. The world, the two countries in the world, would produce 600 units of wheat, 400 of. Now, what's the opportunity cost when Skeletonia is devoting its energies to producing fish? Remember, Skeletonia is fantastic at wheat and pretty good at fish. Well, if it uses half of its energy and time and resources to produce fish, you know what? It produces wheat at twice the rate that it produces fish. In other words, a unit of fish, the resources put into producing fish, to fishing and processing it, costs Skeletonia the opportunity to create 2 units of wheat. In other words, by producing 125 units of fish and not going and taking those resources and putting it into wheat production, it will cost Skeletonia 250 units. How about Zygeria, which is not great at producing fish and is horrible at producing wheat? Well, if we look at the number of this, for every unit of wheat that the Zygeria produces, it will produce a unit and a half of fish. Therefore, 100 units of wheat production will cost Zygeria 150 units of fish. What if, and this is the crux of it, if Zygeria produces only fish and Skeletonia takes half of its fish resources and pushes it into wheat production? Original production, between the two of them, 600 units of wheat, 400 of fish. What happens when Zygeria says we're not going to produce wheat, we're terrible at it? Skeletonia says, well, we're okay at producing fish, but we'll produce less and focus more on what we're really comparatively good at. Do the math. 0 plus 750 is more than 600. 300 plus 125 is more than 100. In other words, even if Skeletonia is better at producing everything, more efficient, more effective, it still makes sense to trade for both sides. If you think today, Germany produces more efficiently virtually everything than, say, Zimbabwe, which is a less developed country. But David Ricardo is one of the first to say, but it still makes sense to create trade relationships because it lets Germany focus on the things they're incredibly good at and let Zimbabwe do the things that, okay, maybe not as good as Germany, but are comparatively better at that than other things. This is outsourcing today. Well, you know what? We can find people to work, English speaking people, telephone call centers. We can pay them less in other countries. Now, are the call centers necessarily as modern, sophisticated, and efficient as the ones that would be in the United States? Maybe not, but we can use the resources we use to produce this relatively simple service and put it in other areas. That's kind of the idea behind cooperative. Oh my God, I've forgotten the word entirely. Sorry, comparative advantage. In other words, trade works better for all. This is the basis of capitalism, from Adam Smith on its way up through David Ricardo. And then we get this man, Karl Marx. Yes, Marxism, communism, etc. This is the guy. Marx, first of all, Marx was wrong about a lot, and I think you have to acknowledge this. Marx was also a pretty brilliant guy who figured out some things that other people had not. Marxism is somewhat, well, it's been fairly on the decline in recent years, but it's something that has to be understood because it's still pretty influential, not only in terms of the few remaining communist countries and the relatively strong, small percentage of the population of the world that says, I am a Marxist, because of Marx's influence, his ideas, how that influenced the rest of the world as well. He considered himself to be a scientist. He says, look, I am a social scientist, and I have studied history, and I found a pattern that repeats itself and still will. History is driven by class struggle. All throughout human history, there have been opposing populations of those who have and those who do not. Now let's go back, let's say caveman days. You have the one caveman with big club and big cave, and him want many, many, many women, and he has the power, so he beats other cavemen over the head and takes over their homes and has more food and has all of their women. Of course, this is a gender patriarchal society at this point. Well, obviously, that's in his interest to get more stuff for him. But for the other cavemen, for the other 99%, it's in their interest to limit his power and take for themselves. Long story short, the many confront the few. There is a massive, massive battle between them. There is a collision, an explosion, and a brand new system comes out of it. Moving more to the more pre-modern world, in feudalism, who is the population that has a lot? Well, it's that small percentage of land-owning nobles. What's their goal? To get more land, to get more wealth, to get more crops from their serfs so that they can sell it off and have more wealth for themselves. Is that the serf's goal? To work as hard as they can so that their lord has more? Of course not. Their goal is to get more land, food for themselves. And built into feudalism, Marx argued, was this inherent contradiction that would lead to a collision between the lord and the serf, and that would explode and destroy feudalism. And a new system would arise. Marx, by the time he's writing in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, 70s, says it's industrial capitalism. And you know what? The same dynamic is there. He calls the two exact classes the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Bourgeoisie means the owning class. Sometimes people say middle class, but that sounds like a teacher. It's not a teacher. It is the bankers, the big owners of businesses, the very, very wealthy, the factory owners, for example. The proletariat is the working class. What's the goal, Mr. Marx, of the bourgeoisie? Well, they have money. They want to make more money. How do they do it? Well, they pay their workers as little as they can, and they continue to get wealthier and wealthier and wealthier. Is the goal of the proletariat to work as hard as he can to get wealth for the owner? Of course not. They want their own. They want their food, their property. They want a better life for themselves. They want better conditions. They want to get out of the slums that they're in. And as more and more people pour into the big cities to work in these horrible factories, their anger will rise. It's kind of like taking a balloon and pressing it hard till it explodes. This would destroy capitalism. It would be a class war, political war, and possibly, probably with violence involved. Most revolutions involve violence. Marx was a little unclear on exactly how this would happen, but he said there will be an inevitable struggle between the owners of the production and the people who work for them. And you know what's going to happen? Like throughout history, the many will eventually win. Capitalism is destined to destroy itself. A new system that he calls both socialism and communism. As you know from changing patterns and patches, they kind of mean different things today. But initially they were somewhat interchangeable. It will emerge and the working people will rule the society, and we move off into a better world of equality and shared production and data. Communism. We own the wealth in common as opposed to individually. And again, Marx didn't say, I hope this happens, I think this might happen. It will happen. He saw it as inevitable. That's a problem with Marx. If you take Marx as a Bible who cannot be wrong, you're probably doing a big service to everybody around you. Got not much to say about Alfred Marshall. In fact, I would probably have left him out of this. In class, I might have mentioned him. But first of all, probably the most important pre-20th century economist in that he wrote the big textbook that was simply used to understand economics. And one of the things he developed, there had been debate for years over the previous century. Hey, what really determines production and price? And some say, oh, it's really how much people are willing to supply. No, no, no. It's how much people demand that will determine it. And Marshall famously says, you know what, it's like a pair of scissors. If you've only got, one piece of metal, you can't cut something. You need them both. So you need both the supply and the demand that will set this. And the idea is, if the price is low, no one's going to want to bother selling it. If the price is really, really, really high, if I find that I can get 5,000 Bolivianos for a pencil, I'm going to go to the stationery store and bring in 1,000 of them because I'll want to sell them. If I can get 1 centavo, I'm not going to bother. And it's the opposite with the demand. Oh, a pencil is 1 centavo? Sure, I'll take a bunch. What? It's 1,000 Bolivianos for a pencil? Well, that place where the demand and the supply meet, that's where the price will naturally set itself. Yeah, that's Adam Smith's invisible hand, as if a hand came and put the production level along the bottom and the price on the left, the y-axis, at this perfect spot. And it's Marshall who kind of formalized this. Then we move to our guy, John Maynard Keynes. I think I said at the beginning I'd get you in and out in an hour, and I think I'm going to manage to do it. I'm at 48 minutes right now. Not bad for, 700 years of economics? Pretty good. Yeah, he was British, John Maynard Keynes. What he's really most known for, the essay I had you read, I just find well-written, interesting, fun, good to think about, all of these things. But he's largely known for a theory that he came up with that is now known as Keynesian economics. Look, one thing we know about capitalism, and nobody, not even the most fervent capitalist, wouldn't deny this, is that there is a natural cycle, a business cycle, where the economy tends to rise and there's more production and there's full employment, and then we hit a point where there is overproduction and there is a decline. We call this a recession, or if it's really bad, we call it a depression. And it's interesting. If you look at the American economy, the U.S. economy, listen to these dates. Things are going well, and then in 1817, there is a depression. And everything recovers and does well, and in 1837, another depression. And things recover and start doing even better, and in 1857, there's a depression. You're probably seeing a trend here. And then things recover through the Civil War, things are going great, and then in 1873 enters another depression. And then things improve and get better. And by the way, the over trend is overall improvement, but there are these interruptions. The next one comes in 1893. Are you noticing about every 20 years there's a collapse in the economy? Now, in the long run, it gets better. But one thing that economists are starting to notice and politicians are worrying about is that each depression seems to be a little more severe and last a little bit longer. And of course, Marx is watching all of this and saying, aha, do you see capitalism destroying itself, the illogic of it? Well, in 1911, it looks like the next economic collapse is about to happen. But you know what happens? J.P. Morgan, the wealthiest man in America, buys up essentially the entire gold supply of the country, and for reasons I'm not really smart enough or informed enough to understand, this stops the depression from happening. The one that seems to come every 20 years. And people are thinking, we've finally gotten smart enough to avoid the boom and bust. It's going to be uninterrupted growth in the free market. End of story. In fact, in August of 1929, U.S. President Herbert Hoover said, "We are on the verge of ending poverty forever. The good times are here to stay." And 2 months later, Wall Street collapsed and the United States and then the world entered into the Great Depression of the 1930s that was far more severe, far more deadly, far more long-lasting than any that come before it. Well, Franklin D. Roosevelt's elected in 1933. Franklin Roosevelt is no politician. Franklin Roosevelt is a guy with a fantastic smile and a reassuring voice and an ending degree of optimism. And Franklin Roosevelt says to the American people, elect me, I'll give you a new deal, and we'll make things better. He didn't know what he was going to do. So he called in some bright young economists and scholars and said, all right, guys, I made promise to people. Tell me what I should do. He said, well, Mr. President, you ever read of John Maynard Keynes? I said, nope, never heard of him. Tell me about him. Well, he's got this slightly crazy idea that rather than when the depression hits, well, we just stand back and let the market take its course because don't worry, in the long run, it will recover. He says that's dangerous to do because people get hurt and people get desperate. His theory is that when the economy falls apart, government should start spending money, putting people to work. You know what? Government handouts to feed themselves, to stay in their homes, and in fact, should cut taxes on people. Well, wait a minute. Won't that lead to a debt? Oh, yeah, we'll have to borrow the money to do it. But here's the thing. If people aren't paying taxes, they have money to spend. Those people who would naturally be out of work during a depression, they're getting a paycheck. And they're going out and they're buying stuff, which keeps the local store open, which keeps the local radio factory or car factory open, which keeps the people employed. And in fact, as demand starts to grow, they start hiring people back. Keynesian economics did not cure the Great Depression, but it did make things a lot better. And quite honestly, by the time we get to the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, pretty much every Western country is a Keynesian. Milton Friedman, who was a conservative free market economist, said, at some level, we are all Keynesians. We recognize a role for a government. Today we look at somebody like Bernie Sanders and say, my God, he's this radical socialist. Bernie Sanders is saying almost nothing that Dwight Eisenhower, who was a Republican and fairly middle-of-the-road conservative president, he would have probably agreed with a lot of it in the 1950s. The idea that, government provide health care for everybody in the country, the idea that it makes sense to have unionized workers because they get a high enough wage so they can afford to go out and buy stuff. Sanders in the 1950s would not be a radical. If you put Bernie Sanders today in Norway, he's pretty middle of the road. From the American perspective from the last 40 years, he is to the extreme left. We'll maybe talk about that later this year. I will let you just take a look at this on your own. I see I'm very close to the 1 hour period of time, and I want to get us up to kind of the present day as well. Do you remember the idea of a liberal? Now, a liberal means a different thing. A liberal politician in the United States, we'll maybe talk about this separately. It's a political thing. But liberals in the 18th century, during the Enlightenment, remember these are Enlightenment thinkers who believe in individual freedoms above all. And an economic liberal in Adam Smith's time would say, we don't want the state to have much voice in the economy. It should be up to individuals. Well, of course, Keynes, who is no socialist, no communist, he is very critical of Marx. He says Marx was just nuts. Marx is just absolutely crazy. I can't believe anybody buys this nonsense. But I'll tell you what, if we just let the free market run itself, and this depression lasts 8, 10, 12 years, A, morally, people are going to suffer by the hundreds of millions. And B, if people lose faith in the capitalist system, they're going to look over at the Soviet Union and see a growing economy. They're going to look at Hitler's fascist Germany and see full employment. And if we don't do something, if we don't manage the economy to make things better for people today, they're going to make some other choices, and we're not going to like the choices they make. Again, that's pretty much established through the 70s, but with Margaret Thatcher in England, Ronald Reagan in the United States, start seeing a return to the free market ideas of getting government out of the economy. Again, neoliberals. It is a new form of liberalism. Would Adam Smith have agreed with the neoliberals of today? I would argue probably not, and certainly not entirely. Adam Smith saw a role for government to make lives better economically and otherwise. Just in his case, he believed it should be like a last course of, or it shouldn't be like the basis of a society. Government determines things, but plays a role. Well, in the United States, the economy is awfully dominant. It is the dominant viewpoint, and of course brought to countries like Bolivia, because the United States has a lot of control with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. What's the basic ideas? Government involvement hurts more than it helps. We need to really limit regulation. My God, you run a business, you have to pay a minimum wage and all these health and safety laws and these environmental regulations. Look, let's get rid of that. Let's lower taxes, lower regulations. What this will do is let the wealthy people make a lot of money. A lot of money. Corporate profits absolutely explode. Now, the argument is not, and that's fine, and to hell with everybody else. No. The theory is that it would trickle down. As wealth accumulates in a few hands at the top, these people, in order to create more wealth, start investing in new businesses, new factories, which provide employment for absolutely everybody or more people. So the theory is that, yes, the wealthy will get much wealthier, but it'll ultimately benefit everyone in society. I think that's something that a lot of people question today, particularly as the rise of the super elite rich. Again, we have billionaires. I actually think the COVID epidemic, what you have a few individuals who have literally increased their economic value by tens of billion dollars, while most people in the world right now are desperately holding on. I think we have seen a questioning of this, and the idea that just simply letting the economy run and stop regulating the stock market, just let the brokers do what they want to, that led to a massive collapse of the economy in 2008, 2009. And without question, a lot of people have not recovered. It would seem strange to draw a comparison between Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, because they probably don't share any basic views in common at all whatsoever. But the fact that both of them became very viable presidential candidates, and no one saw this 15 years ago, it'd be crazy to think of either of those, a large part of that really is a sense that this neoliberal system of let business make as much as it wants to is leaving a lot of people behind. The 2008-2009 economic collapse that we'll look at later in this class might be one of those pivotal events in human history, and it could be centuries from now people talk about the impact of that. Hey, has neoliberalism worked? Free market economics, trickle down. Yeah, I mean, in terms of wealth production, oh, absolutely. There is more wealth and value in the world today than there was 40 years ago. Not even close. Absolutely. Look, unrestrained capitalism produces wealth. That's true. However, it has also created an enormous gap between the haves, the have not, the rich, and the poor. Some would argue, hey, as long as the poor aren't really poorer, who cares how much the rich have? And you can make that argument, although there are increasing number of studies that suggest that what makes societies dysfunctional is not really the total amount of wealth, but that the wealth disparity in a society. It tends to be correlated with earlier deaths, with crime problems, with pandemic diseases, with a lot of unemployment, with a lot of issues. But we'll explore that. The other issue, though, that I think is finally, we hope coming into view. Strictly speaking, capitalism must grow. It must continue to grow. We must produce more and more and more and more, and it continues to grow. Clearly, environmentally, the world can't handle this. If more and more land is used, if more and more water and fossil fuel resources are used, if more and more plastic is produced, we are heading toward an environmental Armageddon. And that's fairly well established among people. Now, there are those who would say, yes, but leave it to the market or human ingenuity. We can continue to grow, we just have to learn how to do it in a sustainable way. I think there's some reasons to be skeptical about that, but some very bright and genuinely concerned people believe that that is the case. But again, notice it's has it worked? I'm not giving you a yes or a no. Two really intelligent, well informed, decent people that are very well versed in all the data they've seen will have very different answers to this. Yes, growth in wealth, major disparity between rich and poor, and we are really seeing an environmental impact of unregulated or less regulated business growth. So we'll see where we go. Great. I got you in a minute, 1 hour, 1 minute, and 50 seconds. That's pretty good. Thanks for your time on this. We will, again, highlight the stuff. It's like, wait a minute, I didn't get this, and hope you can walk out with a good understanding of just the basic big ideas in Western economics for the last couple centuries.